We will read our passage in Hebrews 12 in a moment, but just want to get our thought process started as we get into this. As we've been talking about all morning so far, kind of when we've gotten here, it's that time of year again as we are heading into New Year's in just a few days. And, for many, as we bring a year to a close, we look at the new year as an opportunity for a fresh start, for a clean slate. People make New Year's resolutions. You see people say it's new year, new me. I don't know how that works. It's still you. But at least the first few weeks of the year, I think many are trying to make some changes. I think we have this idea in us that the calendar turning over somehow resets some things. Like January 1st is both a finish line and now a new starting line. We probably see it in our social media feeds. If you're on there, you see people posting of maybe what they was accomplished this last year, what they're planning to accomplish coming into the next year. People publicly celebrating their progress. Apparently this is whatever they're planning to tackle now. But it's social media, whether it's real or not, is debatable in many people's feeds. But I get it. I'm one that I really thrive sometimes off of new beginnings and start dates. My wife and I were talking about this yesterday even a bit. I think I kind of have this mental block, whereas if I'm going to work on something, it has to start at the beginning of a new week, new month, new year, or something. I can't start something in the middle of the week. I'm like, what am I doing here? This is I can't plan around this. It's weird. I have this very distinct mental block, and it's not helpful at all because there's a lot of times where things need to start right now, and I'm I need to start it on a certain schedule. And so, that's just how it works with me. But there is definitely something appealing about this idea that you can close some things and open the book fresh on some new things when the year starts. But obviously, as we are well aware of reality, January 1st coming doesn't actually reset really anything in your life. You wake up on January 2nd, and as the title is this morning, when you wake up on January 2nd, you're still likely find yourself in the middle of a lot of things that you're dealing with. They didn't just all magically reset on January 1st. You think about some of these things maybe we're dealing with, maybe we've been trying to figure out a transition in work or career. Maybe you thought you'd have some clarity now. You've been trying to make some progress on these things. You've been waiting for the right call, the right opportunity, maybe still wondering if you made the right move at some past time or where you're at now. You're unsure of where you're heading. You're still wondering how this is going to work out. Maybe, why we're here, maybe it's the middle of the progress of your spiritual growth, and you've been praying for growth in some areas, and you've been asking God to build patience in you. You've been seeking more closeness in your relationship with Him. Maybe you've been seeking freedom from a pattern of sin that you've been dealing with. Maybe you're making progress, but it feels slow, but you're still in the process of it. Maybe it's a season of parenting that's been tough. Maybe, I don't think any of the real young ones are here today, but it's we've had young ones at times that were going a mile a minute. And maybe now we got the older kids coming that's can't even get a straight answer of what they're going through. You're trying to figure out what exactly they're going through. They don't share things as openly. Maybe we have an adult child that's walked away into some things and we're still praying that God brings them back on the right track again. Maybe we've been in the middle still with our health, as the new year thing usually is. Maybe we've been trying to get in shape or lose weight. It's going slower than we wanted. Maybe we've received a diagnosis or figured out some things that we're still kind of in the middle of processing. Maybe we've been on the recovery from some things. I know even Renee and Joanne have been trying to go through on both of these angles. And, it's taken longer than you'd hoped. It's you hope that things have been resolved by now. It's still in the middle of some things. But January 1st doesn't change that. You're still in the middle. We see our lives that in so many things, the calendar changes, but the middle doesn't disappear. The middle of so many of our situations doesn't disappear. The middle is where most of us actually live, most of our life. We're not just sitting all the time at the starting line of like, oh, we're optimistic, it's a fresh start, and got energy and optimism. Like, that's not usually where we're sitting a lot. And then oftentimes we also aren't always past the finish line on things where we're like, oh, this is great, and we're celebrating and we're relieved and all of these things. Sometimes we find ourselves at those places for certain situations and for certain things. We see something on the horizon, we've been able to deal with something, but most of the time we're still in the middle of processing things. We're somewhere between where we were and where we eventually desire to be. And sometimes these things take time, I think sometimes it's in the middle of our situations where, all the hope that we've had for the situation, we get tired. It's where our faith is tested on some of the things that we're going through. It's where we're tempted oftentimes to just try to rush through everything, to give up on it or just survive it until something changes. But the passage that we're looking at this morning in Hebrews 12, this passage was written really in the way that it was broken down, the way that it's phrased. It was written to people in the middle of things. And I want to read this. We're only going to read the first 3 verses of Hebrews 12. Then we'll reflect on this. But it says, Hebrews 12, starting in verse 1, it says, and we've read this before. It says, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. As you walk through this passage starts with the phrase that says, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. What in the world is the writer of Hebrews talking about when he says, so we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses? Now, the context of this passage, Hebrews 12, comes, after Hebrews 11. Logically, that's how it happened. But Hebrews 11 is a chapter that we talk, like the title of that chapter is usually called like the Hall of Faith. It talks about a lot of individuals and some of the things they went through and the faith that they had as they went through the situations they went through. In the Hall of Faith, you see this long list of people, difficult circumstances. You see Abraham who waited decades for a son that was promised to him and his wife. He was 75, I believe, when God made the promise to him that he was going to have a son. And he was 100 when he held that son in his arms. It was 25 years in that middle gap of waiting. You see Moses in the Hall of Faith. Moses led a grumbling people through the desert, through the wilderness, after God used him to be part of their the freedom and the exodus from slavery in Egypt. He led them out into the wilderness as they complained and struggled and everything that they went through. Moses walked for 40 years with these people through the desert of complaining and problems towards a land that Moses himself never got to walk into. He never entered the promised land. And yet God used him to walk through the desert with them for 40 years, though he never got to go in himself. The Hall of Faith, you see David. David as a young man, as a teenager, who was anointed to be the next king of Israel. But once he was anointed as king, he spent years after that running for his life as the current king sought to kill him. There was this whole time period. He was anointed king, but he didn't get the opportunity to do that yet. He spent years hiding in caves, running for his life, until the day came where he was able to take his rightful place on the throne. In the Hall of Faith, you see person after person. What we're talking about this morning, they were in that middle ground for a while. They had to hold the faith. They had to walk in that middle ground. They didn't get to skip from the promise that God gave them straight to the fulfillment in a day. There was time in between. They had to walk it out day by day, year after year, not having any idea how long that middle ground was going to last. But the writer of Hebrews, and how he wrote this, he wants us to know that they finished. Like they made it to the other side. It's those that finished, and they finished well, they held the faith. It's the context that's brought to this passage that says they're the cloud of witnesses. Like they made it to, be in God's presence. They made it through everything that God had them go through. And now they are this, kind of this, crowd in the stadium of witnesses watching the rest of us, live this out. When we read through that passage that leads towards this one today, we find out that we're not the first person that's been stuck in the middle of something, obviously. You're not the first person to wonder if this season's ever going to end. You're not the first person to feel like the road is longer than you expected to get to the other side. We know, like all of us have our situations. Like you are in good and plentiful company if that's where you find yourself today. But these people, in these examples, they made it through. And I know with God's faithfulness as he carried them through, it's the same faithfulness he has in carrying us through. But notice again in our passage, our main passage today in Hebrews 12, notice what comes next. It says, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And then it says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. I want us to be very clear in seeing this when it says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. That there is two categories in that phrase. Lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Sin is clearly mentioned. I would hope that should be the obvious stuff for us. Like we know that things are wrong. Like we know, maybe we haven't learned it all yet, but we know God's standards on a lot of things. We know things that are wrong, and we know things that we get caught up in. And we've talked about this before. We have to deal with those things. Like if we are caught up in just a way of sin, like the way of sin is never the way of Christ. Like, the old saying, which I've always appreciated, it says like we have to be killing sin or it will be killing us. If we let it be there, it's a disease, it's an infection, and it will kill us. The writer here is saying that we need to deal with sin. We've talked about that. That should be a given. I don't want to make light of it. It needs to be done. But it also has another category here, not just sin. It talks about these weights. Weights in this passage is different than sin. A weight, as it's referred to here, isn't necessarily something bad. In the right context, it might even be something good. But it's something that's slowing you down. It's something that's making the middle that we're in right now harder than it needs to be. It's adding resistance to a race that's already demanding. It's like you hook yourself up with resistance bands and you're trying to run against it. Well, they're holding you back. They're holding you in place. Or it's like, putting a ball and chain around your leg and trying to run with it. You've added weight. You've added resistance. Maybe for us, some examples, maybe for us, one of those weights has been the weight of comparison, something we've talked about a lot. But this is in a different sense here. When we see the weight of comparison, maybe we're looking at somebody else's race that they're running, because this is in the context of a race. We're looking at somebody else's race. We're looking at their timeline, their progress, their blessings. Again, the highlight media on social media, like the highlight reel on social media of the life that they're living. And every time you keep looking over at their race, you're losing a step in your own race. You watch somebody sprinting in the Olympics, and they're not looking around, unless you have some of these crazy fast guys like Usain Bolt or whatever. He was running, he's way out in front of everybody. It's like, where's everybody at? Because he's just that ridiculously fast. But these guys that are, pushing for everything they've got, they're not looking around they're just trying to make sure that they're the first one across the finish line. But the more that we look at everybody else's race around us, it's slowing us down in ours. I'm looking over there and I'm losing a step. I'm falling back. I'm getting pulled back by looking around so much. We've talked about how comparison can be so exhausting, how it steals our gratitude. And it's very possible that our comparison of our middle with everybody else's is making our middle feel worse than it actually is, because we're just looking at everybody else's. Again, maybe our weight, there's so many of these that we could go into, but maybe our weight is comfort. Maybe we've gotten so used to avoiding discomfort that you're unwilling to do the hard things that growth requires. Maybe it's difficult conversations to be had. Maybe it's disciplining ourselves in a way that costs us something. Like, I've got to give something up, make hard choices in doing that. Again, maybe it is giving up the things at the end of the day that I don't really need because they're just weights that I'm adding on. Maybe it's obedience that doesn't feel good in the moment because maybe we've been choosing the easy path over the progress path. Easy over building endurance, and it's keeping us stuck in the same place year after year. Maybe our weights is other people's expectations. What my kids think, my wife thinks, my parents think, my brothers and sisters, my friends. Like, maybe I'm trying to work my way through all of these things, just trying to live up to other people's expectations. Maybe what our social circle considers success. I'm just trying to be successful in that context. And you're carrying a pressure or a weight into your race that was never meant to be run for their approval, because we're living for God's approval. Maybe we just have the weight of control issues. Maybe we're gripping so tightly to our own plans and our own timeline and our own expectations of how things should go that we've really been hindering God's plans that might be different than the plans that we have made. Maybe we're holding on to something so desperately that maybe we just need to open our hands up and let go of. The reality is that we're fighting the middle ground instead of walking through it. And because the reality hasn't matched our expectations, it's caused us to maybe harbor some bitterness and frustration and discouragement. Not because God has failed in what God does, but maybe because we have this mindset where he just hasn't operated on my schedule. And here's what I want us to see in considering all of those things. Sometimes we're not stuck in the middle ground because the road is too hard to walk. Maybe we're stuck in the middle ground because we're carrying too many of these weights. I said there's so many other ones. It could be the examples we give, and it could be other weights that we've tacked on over the years. Maybe we've picked up things along the way that were just never meant to be carried in the race that we're running. The invitation today, as we're looking at this passage, it says, lay aside the weights. Like the invitation today as we read this, the writer of Hebrews is telling us is to lay down the weights. As we sit here today, I just encourage you. Again, New Year's not changing anything besides the calendar. But what are the things that we need to set aside as we go into this new year? And don't even wait till January 1st. It's December 28th. You got a couple more days of progress before that point. Lay them on down. We need to deal with the sin, like it's talked about here. You know what that is. If we've got sin, that we're dealing with in our lives, you're dealing with it. These are things that need to be cleaned out. But sometimes the weights for us aren't as obvious. Sometimes we've just tacked them on over the years and we haven't really felt the weight of them until maybe hopefully sit here today and say, yeah, there are some things that I've brought into the mix that don't need to be in the mix. They've been slowing us down, and it's finally time to lay down the weights. The next phrase in this passage, it says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. It says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. I want you to see the words that are used here. When the writer wrote this, he didn't say, run your race with speed. If it's a race, typically it's like run as fast as you can. It's not run with speed, it's run with endurance. God isn't asking you to like sprint as fast as you can through whatever middle situations you're in right now. He's not asking you to rush to the finish line as fast as possible. He's encouraging us to stay faithful through the middle until we get to the end, to keep going, to not quit, even not knowing what that end looks like, but trusting in his faithfulness as we continue with endurance to walk or run or crawl or whatever it takes to keep moving in that direction. There's a big difference between getting through something and growing through something. Like when we look at all of our situations, you can fight your way through a hard season of life and you can come out the other side of it still completely unchanged. Or you can walk through that season with your eyes wide open, looking for what God is doing to grow you in that season and come out the other side of it learning some things and transformed. It says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. The second part of that statement says the race that is set before us. Like there is a race that has been given and been pre-planned for each one of us. It's different for all of us. The race that you're running is different than your neighbor. It's different than the person sitting next to you. Obviously, some of us in family stuff, we're running, parallel races in a lot of ways, but every one of our races is a little bit different. It's not your neighbors. It's not that person that you were comparing to on social media. Even though their life looks like it's so put together, you're not running their race. It's not even necessarily the race that you wish you were running. You're running the race that was set before you. You have your own timeline. You have your own obstacles. You have your own middle ground. Sometimes when we try to make those comparisons with other people, sometimes we're comparing our race, at the second lap or at chapter 5 to somebody's chapter 20. It's a completely different part of the race. But we're comparing our place in this race to a completely different place in their race. Again, doing that steals the joy out of our own race. And sometimes when we go through these things, I think we end up with a question. I think a question that we should consider. Like, why does the middle have to be so long sometimes? Like, why does it have to be so long sometimes? Why doesn't God just fast forward us to the finish line of the race? A while back, we went through the book of James, and James did really well in explaining the purpose of this to us. In James chapter 1, if you recall when we went through this, you read this passage. We studied through this. James 1, verses 2 through 4, James says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." If we hear what James says in that passage, James says that the testing of your faith produces patience. Like the going through of that middle ground produces patience. And patience, if it's allowed to do its full work in us, it says produces completeness. The truth that James is telling us in that passage is that God isn't just making you wait through the middle. He's making you complete through the middle. He's forming something in you that can only be formed in that place. It's the character that he's developing in you right now. In the waiting, in the uncertainty, in the long-term obedience. He's building character, and that's not a byproduct of a situation. That's a product of what God is doing purposefully in our race in that situation. Paul wrote a similar statement in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. Paul wrote, he says, "And not only that, but we glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope." Paul, in a very similar way, shows us a progression of work that's happening. It says tribulation to perseverance to character to hope. God's plan is not for us to skip any of the steps of that process. We like things quickly in this day and age. Like, cooking analogy in my mindset, it's like you can't just heat up some character in the microwave real quick. That would be convenient. But making character in us is like a slow cooker or throwing something on the smoker for 16 hours experience. Like, it takes some time. It takes some heat. It takes some time for things to break down and for things to cook. And it's like, we need that. That character is built in the middle ground when no one's watching. Maybe it's really difficult. Quitting would be really easy and understandable. But that's not God's call for our life and our race as we run it. Again, the same guy who wrote that passage in Romans is the same guy that was writing to the Philippians. In Philippians 3, he talks about how he's still in the middle of a lot of things. Paul wrote, he says, "Brethren, I do not count myself as having apprehended." Like, I'm not there yet. I haven't gotten to the goal yet. I haven't gotten the prize. I haven't made it to the finish line yet. He says, "I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, I reach towards those things which are ahead." So he's in the middle, getting rid of the stuff behind him, reaching towards the things ahead of him. He says, "I press towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." This is the Apostle Paul speaking. He's the guy that wrote the majority of the New Testament. He planted churches across the Roman Empire. He encountered Jesus on the Damascus Road. He did more to spread the gospel in the early days of the church than probably anyone else in history. But Paul still said, I haven't arrived yet. I'm still in this middle ground. I still got things behind me. I got things ahead of me, and I'm in the middle right now, still pressing forward for the call of Jesus Christ. If Paul was still in the middle of things, I would think we should expect that we're still going to be in the middle of things too. But there's a refocus of our own situation that I want to get to in considering these things this morning as we come into the new year. Consider this. Consider a refocus of how we look at things. What if the middle isn't a waste of time? What if the middle is not just a holding pattern until we get there? What if it's not just us thinking that God is taking too long to answer our prayers? What if the middle ground in our life is the most growth-focused season of our life? What if God is doing his deepest work in this time right now that we've been trying to get through? In this place that we're so eager to escape, this is where God is doing the hard work in our life. I want us to refocus towards that, and I want us to consider that, but I do know, obviously, practically, that even if we accept that thought process this morning, it doesn't automatically make things easier. Understanding that God is doing something in the middle doesn't magically make it shorter. You can know in your head that this season is producing character, but it still be pretty tired and exhausting with how long that it's taking. So how do we actually walk through this middle ground? What does the writer of Hebrews tell us about how we should keep going when we're tired? How do we stay faithful when we can't see the finish line? We can't even see the light at the end of the tunnel. Verse 2 here, after it talks about running this race with endurance that is set before us, laying aside the weight, laying aside the sin, running with endurance. And then in verse 2 it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The how is right there at the start of verse 2. The how in running our race, making it through the middle ground, the how is looking unto Jesus. So much we can't even look past our circumstances. All I can see is my circumstances. All I can see is these things that are weighing on me. I can't see the end. I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I can only see my circumstances. And in that, I'm failing to look unto Jesus, as this passage is telling us. I don't need to be looking at other people's progress. I don't need to be looking at everything that's not working out yet. I need to be looking unto Jesus. This passage says that he's the author of our faith. When he's the author of our faith, that means he wrote it. He started it. He's the one that drew us unto himself in the first place. If you have a desire for God in your heart at all, he is the one that put it there. You didn't find him. Scripture is so clear that he found us. He did what he did for us. But it also says there that he is the finisher of our faith. That means that he'll complete it. Scripture is very clear that he doesn't start things that he doesn't intend to bring to completion until they're finished. So there is a middle ground, but the middle ground is not outside of his plan. He starts, he finishes, and he has a plan for what happens in between. He's not surprised that you're still where you're at right now. He's not confused by how long this is taking. He's not shaking his head wondering how this is all going to work out. He authored the story and he knows exactly how it ends, and he knows all the chapters in the book to get there. But there's a phrase here, and this is what we've talked about in times past of looking at Jesus' example here. There's a phrase here that says, who for the joy, talking about Jesus, says, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. See, we look at that cross moment a lot. Like obviously we get towards Good Friday, Easter, but all throughout our Christian lives, like we look back to the truth of the cross. But there was, like we know, we celebrate on Christmas his birth, we celebrate on Easter and Good Friday his death and resurrection, but there was a whole lot of middle ground even for Jesus between that starting point and that end point. Jesus didn't endure the cross through just sheer willpower. It wasn't just gritting his teeth and pushing through. He did that. But this passage tells us that he endured it for the joy that was set before him. He said, I've brought this up many times. But there was something on the other side of the middle ground that Jesus was walking that made the walk worth walking. The joy of the destination sustained him through the agony of the path to get to that destination. What was the joy that was set before Jesus? Again, as we've talked about before, the joy that was set before Jesus was you, it was me, it was everybody that he would save. It was a redeemed people, it was a finished work, it was his kingdom established, it was him seated at the right hand of his Father as he intercedes for us right now. He looked through the agony of the middle ground of the cross and he saw what was coming. He said the joy of that destination sustained him through the darkest middle ground that anyone has ever walked. What can we learn from that? I think what we can learn from that is that we need a joy that is set before us too. Jesus had something he was looking forward to as he was walking through all of the difficulty. We need something that is worth walking towards. Otherwise, the middle ground will probably just beat us down and crush us if there's nothing worth walking towards. As you sit here today, like, what's the joy that is set before you? That could be so many things. I mean, core, like central in our life as a Christian, I think the best of that joy is becoming more like him. Like becoming more like him as we see his example, we see how he walked and we see what he did. As we become more like him, it's undoing the distortion that sin created in us and becoming more like the one who saved us. Like that means something forever, not just for here. Like that means something forever. It's seeing the fruit in this life that only comes after seasons of, tilling the ground and planting the seeds and watering everything, going through all of that work to see the harvest come. But going through all of these things and even a joy that is set before us And sometimes even just seeing the people that we'll be able to help on the other side of all of this. Because maybe the path that God has made for you specifically is a path that is intended for you to be able to help people on the other side with one day. Maybe somebody on the other side of this needs what you're learning right now. God is preparing you to be that person to minister to them. But when we find that thing, when we find the joy that is set before us, and there's so many things that can be that. But when we find a destination that is worth it, the middle ground becomes walkable. Not necessarily easy, but walkable. I want you to notice, as I try to wrap this up, notice verse 3. Verse 3 says, "For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls." Even in just these 3 verses, there's a lot. And in this 3rd verse, there's actually a warning here as well. The warning here is that you will become weary and discouraged if you stop looking at Jesus. It says, consider him who endured all of these things. Otherwise, you will become weary and discouraged in your souls. Again, the warning here is you take your eyes off of him, expect to become weary and discouraged. The antidote for discouragement in this middle ground isn't just trying harder, though we need to put in the effort required. It's not just muscling through with more discipline, though we need to be disciplined in the life that we're living. But the true antidote through all of this is looking at Jesus. When your eyes drift away to just seeing the difficulty and the problems, discouragement will come with that. But when you fix your eyes on him, on who he is, on what he's done, on where this is all going, then endurance becomes possible. So just finally, so we take all of this, kind of the challenge that we can close this out with. We are heading into this new year. Again, just a calendar change, but it is an opportunity, I think. For me, it always is like, what are we going to do? I always reflect, what did we do this last year? What can I do better going into the next? Again, the new year won't erase your middle ground. January 1st won't fast forward you to any finish line. You're going to wake up still in the process. Still between where you are right here and where you hope to end up at. But you can make some changes. You can shift your focus. I want you to identify some things. As you leave here today, identify, is there sin that I need to deal with? That needs to be dealt with. Here to help in any way we can in dealing with things. But also, are there weights that are holding me back? You think of simple middle ground things I always have these analogies because it's easy to make analogies on financial stuff. It's we're not getting where we want to financially, but we're still making all these bad decisions of what we're buying and what we're doing and all these things. Well, changes can be made. It's just we have weights because now I've created this life of comfort and expectations, or I've instilled that into my children and all of these things where, we're going to put all of these resources towards that, but those resources are never making it to the goals that we want to achieve. It could be things like that. What are the weights that we need to lay aside? What are the things that are slowing us down from getting to the goals? A lot of these can be practical middle grounds, like I said, of finances or health or things that we can be working on. But also spiritual growth things, what's stopping me from growing? Even as we see here today, I'm happy to have you guys here today. And it's how are we investing into each other? What's stopping us from even being here at times with each other? What can we change for that, where we can be committed to, being this family together, to be committed about our growth, to be committed to checking in on each other, to be part of our real spiritual growth process. Again, deal with the sin, lay down the weights. The second, we need to make sure that the race that we're running is actually our race. We're not just looking at everyone else's, looking for anyone else's approval besides the Lord. We need to be running the race that is set before us. And third, I just encourage you to check where your eyes have been fixed. Have all you've been looking at is your circumstances, your frustration on everything that's not working, or have we had our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith? Because what this passage is telling us today is that where we look will determine how we run. Again, the middle ground today is not just a holding pattern. It's not just wasted time. It's not evidence that God has forgotten you in any way. It's where God does his deepest work in us. It's where patience is developed. It's where character is built. It's where faith stops being just theoretical and hopefully becomes a lot more real and practical in our lives. I encourage you to, just because we're not running this alone. You're running your own race, but you're not running it alone. We're all still running this side by side. We're in this together. And the truth that I love that we see in our Savior is that no matter what your middle ground is right now, you've got other believers running alongside of you. And you have Jesus who meets you in every middle that you have every single time. It says what he starts, he will complete. And I trust him completely in that. So, let's pray.